All right, let's get started. So, hi, welcome to lecture 6. Today we're going to be talking about table views. Before we start, just some announcements. So P3 is technically due today, but normal slip days apply, so you can submit it on Wednesday with no penalty. And so I think on the announcements, I said that I'm going to be announcing the day for the Meet Your Mentor event. But we haven't decided that yet, so we're going to announce it on Wednesday. It's probably going to be like sometime on like Friday. We don't want it to be on the weekend because I guess you guys have other fun things to do. So yeah, I guess more about that on Wednesday. Okay. Cool. So let's start with the review. Oh, not that. Not that. This. Okay. There you go. So there's only 3 questions this time, and we're just going to review the basics of the delegation and protocols that we talked about last week. And as always, join with your net ID so you can get extra credit. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Cool. That is me. Oh. Hello, Walker White. All right, waiting on 1 or 2 more. All right, I'm gonna start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So the speaker in this room doesn't really work, so I'm just going to play it from my computer. Yeah, close enough. So the first question, how do you present or push a new view controller? Ooh, okay. So let's quickly review this. Okay, well, so the media is not very helpful. So remember there's 2 types of ways to kind of present or push a new view controller. You can either present it as like a modal, so it kind of like lays over on the screen. Remember from lecture 1 last week. So the way you do that is presenting a view controller. So you do self.present, and this view controller kind of slides out from the bottom. That's the first option. The second option is using a navigation controller, right? So that's kind of like the base of your view controllers, and you're kind of stacking more views on. And the way you do that is you access a navigation controller and you push it on. Okay, so there's presenting, which is kind of like laying over, and pushing. Pushing is where you like you push a new one on top of the stack. Okay, cool. Oh, where's the next one? Okay. So those aren't net IDs, but we'll keep going. So how do we use delegation? Sorry, why do we use delegation? Nice, cool. So everybody seems pretty familiar with this. The point of delegation is so that we can pass information between views. Right, when we're building apps, we don't want to only have one view, otherwise it's very boring. We're going to have multiple views, and to kind of like pass information between them, we would use this delegation and protocol pattern. Okay. So good job, AC2623 being at first place. All right, last question. Now, what is a protocol? Right, we talked a bit about this delegation and protocol pattern, but what actually is this protocol? Nice. Okay, so most people got it, but just to reiterate, a protocol we can think of kind of like a Java interface, right? Where you're saying like, okay, so I have this interface of a shape, right? And I give it a bunch of properties. So, I can calculate the area of a shape, right? That's like a property of the shape. So a protocol is basically the same thing here. It's like you're defining a bunch of methods, properties, or other values that a specific type would have. And if different views wanted to kind of implement that, they would conform to that protocol by implementing those methods. Okay, cool. So, nice. Okay, I think I know who the first two are, but okay. And nice. All right, so well done to the people who actually use NetIDs. Please remember to use your NetID next time for extra credit, and that'll be great. Cool. Okay, so let's get into today's lecture. Let's close this, close that. All right, so today we're going to be talking. About UI table views. So this is going to be the first lecture today about how this big class of scroll views. What is a scroll view? A scroll view is basically a sophisticated a component. Remember, from our first lecture, a component is kind of like a bunch of basically like a view that's implemented for you, right? It has a lot of functionality that you don't have to deal with. So a table view is one of those, right? And the one that we're going to cover on Wednesday is called a collection view. So today we're talking about table views. So what is a table view? A table view is basically a view that used to present a scrollable list. So, kind of in the name, right? You can relate the idea to, say, a Microsoft Word table or like a Google Docs table, right? You have some type of header, and then you have a bunch of rows. And in each of the row, you put some data in it. And, you can scroll up and down. There's it displays more or less data. So that's basically what a UI table view is. And let's see a quick example. So here we can see a quick example. Hopefully the one on the left you've seen before. This is the iOS native settings app, right, where you can kind of scroll up and down and you can have a bunch of settings. And on the right-hand side, we have this kind of music playing app, Spotify if you use it. And every row is kind of like a song entry, right? So these are two examples. And if you look to the left, you can see that that one actually is a bit more sophisticated, right? It has kind of like spacing between the rows. And you see on the top, there's the name of the person. And between that icon, there's and the airplane mode, there's a gap. And then between the hotspot and notifications, there's also another gap, right? Those are called sections. We'll go into more detail later. So let's quickly break down this table view, right? What is it composed of? So kind of the first layer is a bunch of sections, right? So a table view, you have multiple sections. And if you don't tell it how many sections it has, it just defaults to one, right? So it's just one big section. And each section can be broken down into multiple rows, right? And these rows can be different heights, but all the rows in one section have to be the same height. So that's one small quirk. And finally, in each row, we kind of put a TableView cell, and inside this TableView cell, like all the UI, all the components that begin with UI, right? You can just treat it as like a normal view controller or normal view that you've worked with, and all the auto layout and constraining things that we've learned all apply within the TableView cell. Okay, and so we'll see a demo for that later. So here's the example again, right? Here we have the higher level sections, right? So the top is a section, the bottom is, the middle two are also sections. And between sections, we can define a certain amount of spacing, and we can also make it look a certain way. So over here, this is the default way, the colors between sections are, and it's gray. And as I mentioned just now, right? The rows in the section, they don't have to be the same height, right? So the top one we see is a lot taller, and it looks pretty different from the rows in the middle, right? You can define it to be different. And the way you do that, there's a bunch of functions that you can set within the TableView methods. So that's provided to you by UIKit. And then, of course, within the row, that's where you put the cell. And we're going to go into a lot more detail later about the cell, but you can just kind of think of it as a small little UI view or UI view controller. And within it, you kind of lay elements, right? So you can immediately see on the left, there's an image, right? So you probably do image view constraint to the view's left anchor or leading anchor. And then you would put a UI label there. Those are some examples we'll go into later. Okay, so that's the visual part of what the UI table view looks like. So now let's break down in terms of how it works, and also how we're going to set it up. Okay, so there are four main parts of this UI table view. There's the table view controller, so that's like what's managing everything, and also like say for example I want to set a custom row height, a custom number of sections. That's where I would be setting it, right? This is a table view controller. And there is a data source object that basically provides information to the table view controller. So we'll see later, that's usually the view controller that you place the table view within, right? Again, we'll see more examples. And then after that, there is the delegate object. So the delegate object is basically, so you don't have to fully implement everything in the delegate object, but there's like functions such as did select row at, did deselect row at. So say you want to interact with your table, right? If I click on the table, you wanted to say push to a certain view controller or like toggle some value, right? That is why that is where all that's handled in is within the delegate object, right? So how do you manage user interaction with the contents of the table? And then finally, it's the actual cell. So that's where you're actually populating the data. Okay, so those are the four parts. Okay, so now we're going to go over like how we're actually set it up, right? So we went over the views, we went over like the higher level structure of it. So now let's actually go into the detail of how we set it up. The first part, okay, so the first part is, this part should be somewhat familiar, right? So we kind of set it up the same way we set up most of our UI components. So give it a name, and then you do like, actually before that line, you probably like declare table view as like var table view of type UITableView, right? Somewhere up top. And so over here, you're actually instantiating the table view on the first line. And the second line, you're setting the translate auto remasking, auto resizing mask into constraints. That's the super long value that basically allows you to use auto layout and the constraint and anchor things that we've been talking about. And so make sure you set that to false. Otherwise, whenever you try to do ns auto layout constraint .activate, it will just crash. Okay? And so this part should be somewhat familiar. And also make sure you actually add it to the parent view. Now, after this, we're going to set up the things that we mentioned before, right? The other four items. So that's the data source, the delegate, and we also need to kind of tell the table view, right? So later on, we're going to go into more detail of how we kind of set this custom cell, right? Because the UI table view has a default cell, which is just blank, right? And that's not very helpful. So we're going to override that and make our own cell. But in order to let your table view know that we've actually made our own custom cell, we need to register it. And so that's the third step, right? So setting the data source, setting the delegate, and then registering your custom cell. Okay? So now I want to go through them one by one, and just by setting that, there's also other things you have to implement. So first, the data source. Oh, okay, let me move my face. Oh. Okay, so first the data source. The data source you can think of as what is providing information to my table view, right? And so in this example, over here on the screen, I'm just using like the most basic way I can set it up. So I create a new project, right? I only have like the default view controller, right? That's like the root view controller. And in that root view controller, I'm setting up this table view. So if I write the line TableView.dataSource is equal to self, what I'm basically saying is this table view that I'm creating right now is going to get the information from this root view controller. Okay, so its data source is self. Self being like the view controller code, the view controller file that you're writing in right now. So yeah, so when you set that, that's basically declaring what the data source is. But after you declare it, you need to conform to this protocol, right? Because you're basically saying that this view controller, is able to provide data. That's the idea of conforming to the UITableView data source. But after you conform to it, you actually need to provide the information, right? And so that's when you need to implement these two functions. The third one is optional, right? So how do you provide the data? You basically define these. So the number of rows per section is kind of just saying like, for this current section, how many rows do I need to display, right? So that's an integer. But like practically when you're actually implementing it, you're not just going to give like 5, right? You're going to actually have the value be based on what your, say, array or like your data structure that's containing the data actually is, right? So if it's an array, you do like array.count, for example. And the second one is, this is a lot more complicated. We're going into a lot more detail later, but this is basically saying at this current row, so this function has a parameter which takes in an index path, which kind of saying, it's kind of like the index I of an array, right? At this current row, what do I want to display? And so these are like the corresponding function names. And so I have some tips of how to quickly implementing this later on. So you don't actually have to memorize these. You don't actually have to even write that down. Yeah, and the final one is actually also optional. So the number of sections is kind of like as we saw before in the settings app, where we have like a bunch of different parts that are like split up with like a big gray spacing. But this number of sections function is optional because if you don't set it, it's just going to be 1. Okay. So that's the data source. This is how it actually looks like when you're implementing it. So note how I did it in extension. You don't have to do this. You can just write all the functions up in the top of the class. But it's a lot better if you do it like this, right? Because as you're implementing or having your view controller conform to multiple protocols, you're going to be writing a lot more functions, and it's going to get very messy, right? If someone else reads your codes, they're like, yuck, what's going on, right? So by splitting it up into extensions, you're kind of saying, okay, so this view controller is conforming to the data source, and here are the relevant functions, right? So when I'm scrolling through, it's a lot easier to read. Okay, cool. And so this is basically what I was talking about just now. Over like the number of rows in section, I'm kind of assuming that I have this table data array, right? And over here, we're going into a lot more detail again later here, but this self of row at is basically what I will be returning, right? It's basically the cell that I will be returning at a specific row, okay? Yeah, that's all I want to say for that. Okay, so any questions about the data source just now? Cool. Okay, so this will be a lot more clear when we go into the demo, but let's just bear with the theoretical parts for now. So the next part is the delegate. So the delegate object, as we mentioned before, is it's basically used to handle user interactions with what's actually in the table, right? So the example I gave just now is, say I'm clicking on the rows, right? I want it to say change color, right? Or I click on, say for example, it's like a food delivery app, right? You click on, say, a restaurant, and it pushes to that restaurant's menu, right? It's another example. So in order to have that behavior, to actually interact with the contents of the table, we implement the delegate. And this is the exact same logic here, right? I'm basically saying the table view, so what is going to tell me what to do type of idea, the table view's delegate is going to be equal to the self. Self is basically the view controller that you're kind of typing in right now. And again, after you assign self as being the delegate, you need to conform to the delegate, right? Saying, okay, so this view controller can tell me what to do, but what is it going to tell me to do, right? So that's when you need to implement these two functions. And as we mentioned just now, right, you don't actually have to implement the functions in the delegate. They're all optional, but as we will see later, it makes it look a lot better, and we highly recommend you implement at least the height of the row for the delegate. Otherwise, it looks pretty cramped. Okay, cool. And these are, of course, the corresponding functions, but you don't have to memorize them. And here's a quick example. So again, we're having the view controller conform to the view delegate. And here is basically me implementing the height for row at. This is just some constant value. Usually this is fine being a constant value because these are just UI components. But you wouldn't just use a hard-coded number. You probably define some constant up the top and just return that constant. Cool. Okay, so the last part now we're going to talk about kind of registering a cell. So just now, if you remember, the cell for row at function, right? I defined a cell and I kind of returned the cell. So this is the part where we're kind of dealing with the cell, which is basically what we put within a row to actually display. The default cell is pretty ugly. It's just a blank cell. It's actually completely useless. So we override it and make our own cells. And over here, we see two very pretty examples of a custom UITableView cell. On left, we can see a TableView cell that we use in Uplift, one of our apps. And on the right, this is a custom cell that we have for Transit. This is also one of our apps. And this line, TableView.register, is basically saying, right, I don't want to use your default ugly blank cell. I want to use my own cell. And the way you define it is you do TableView.register. You pass in the class, and then you also pass in the string. And this for reuse identify string is actually really helpful when you don't want to kind of create a bunch of cells. So let's consider an example of a Spotify playlist, right? Say I'm like some popular person, I have a really, really long playlist, I have a lot of songs, right? It's fine if I have like only a couple hundred, maybe your phone can handle it, but when you have like 2,000, 2 million, a ton of songs, and you have a table view and you put your songs within that table view, and you create a cell for each of the songs, your phone's gonna explode, right? Because it's creating a lot of cells and it's not actually using it, right? Because on the screen, you can only display, say, like 10 max, right? So here's where we use the idea of kind of like not creating cells for kind of parts that we can't see, right? So say, for example, there's a lot of songs down here, but we can't see them, right? So we're not going to create a cell for those. But once the user scrolls, when a cell kind of goes out of view, then that cell can be recycled, right? We dequeue that cell and reuse that cell that we kind of just got off from scrolling up, and we use it to kind of add to the new cell, right? When I'm displaying it. So when I'm scrolling, some of the rows go off and some of the new rows come in, right? So that's the idea of dequeuing and reusing the cell. And in order for the table view to know which cell to actually dequeue, you need to give it a unique string of saying this cell is like represented by this string, right? So this may seem pretty useless when I only have one table view because there's only one cell, right? But say you have multiple table views kind of side by side, right? And as you see in the project, you have one collection view and one table view. Then this actually becomes important, right? Because you don't want to dequeue the wrong cell. Otherwise, like stuff just starts disappearing from your app. So that's the idea of dequeuing and reusing the cell. Mainly, it's for efficiency reasons, and you don't have to create a bunch of extra cells that you're not actually displaying. Okay? Cool. So this is just to rehash the setup. First, you kind of initialize and lay out the table view. So that's the same as any UI label, UI text field, like the stuff that we've worked with already. That part's the same. And then you want to create your custom UITableView cell, right? So that's the part that we will see later. But that's also the class that you'll be using to register, and also when you're dequeuing, you'll be dequeuing this cell. Then after that, you would register this custom cell, and you would set your table views, data source, and delegate, right? So you do TableView.delegate equals self, TableView.datasource equals self, and then finally, you would conform to it, right? So you create your extensions, you implement the functions, or the required functions, and you build, and hopefully it works, okay? So any questions about this? Cool. All right. So now we're going to move on to the demo. Okay. Oh, oops, I forgot to finish that slide. So the starter code for our demos, as always, is going to be under the relevant week for the textbook. So after this lecture is like done and we upload it to YouTube, it's going to be kind of like put here. But the starter code for this today's lecture is under UITableView Demo, and we have the starter here. And this code is like pretty complex when it's the first time you see it. So I've also uploaded the completed demo, so you can kind of refer back to it when you're doing your project or doing your hack challenge. Maybe you want to use table views or collection views to kind of make fancy stuff. Okay? Cool. So this thing I have here right now is exactly, I'm going to move my face down here. Okay, here we go, nice. So what I have here right now is exactly the same as the starter code that I have linked from the textbook. So feel free to download that now. I'll give you guys a couple minutes, and then we will get started, okay? The presenter mode?
Themes, and then presentation. You can also just do command comma. I think it's a default to that.
Wait, what's the?
What?
This is so ugly.
Just do the presentation.
No, I got it. I'll just do this.
Okay. Do you have anything with the lights or anything?
It's fine. All right. Hopefully, for those who want to actually download it, you can download it, and you have this set up like this. So there are some files that have already been written. I'll quickly go over those and we can get started. So the first file is this cafeteria. Let me just zoom out a little bit. Okay. So if it's on the screen, this cafeteria file is basically like the model of the model view controller paradigm that we've talked about. We basically use it to kind of represent the structure of our data, right? And so, if you want to learn more about, how to create structures of data, maybe, working with backends, you can take the Intro to Backend course, right? But for now, we can think of this as kind of like the structure of our cafeteria data. And I've implemented some relevant stuff that I think is important for a cafeteria, right? So maybe what I think about the cafeteria, right? That's the cafeteria rating. So say, for example, we're talking about Toni Morrison. Wow, that's amazing. That's great. But if we're talking about, say, I don't know, Appel, right? It was like bad. I don't know. So that's like some rating. And then we also have the name, whether or not I really like the cafeteria. So that's his favorite Boolean. And the rating, right? So the actual rating is in this rating, but the enum here is kind of like, representing the rating as a bunch of possible values, right? So I don't want to just do like an integer because that can be anything. I don't want to just do a string because that could also be anything. But if I set it as being some enum, then it can only be a bunch of certain values. Okay, cool. And these functions are just like helpful to get data that I actually want to represent. Cool, so that's the cafeteria file. In the scene delegate, remember we set this up as the same as we talked about in previous lectures. So that's just setup code. I'm not going to talk about that. And we didn't touch this file, so that's fine. Okay, so let's get started. So now I want to, in this demo, I'm basically going to show you how we set up a table view and kind of like play around with this table view. So the first thing we're going to do is actually instantiate it. So I have a var declared up here and kind of created already, so I'm done with that part. But remember, right, but this is kind of like the same as all our other components that are provided by UIKit. We need to set its translate auto resizing your mask into false, right? So I can actually use my programmatic constraints. And, okay, 1 second. Okay, cool. And I also want to make sure that I add it to my view. So, that's just basic setup stuff. And I'm just going to activate my constraints here, which I have commented out. I'm just going to build it. Command B. So these constraints are basically saying I want the table view's top anchor to be the top anchor of my view controller, table view's bottom anchor to be the bottom anchor of my view controller, leading and trailing anchor to be the leading and trailing anchor of my view controller. Basically, stretch my table view to cover my entire view controller. Okay? So that part's set up, nice. So now we can actually, walk through the steps, right? So the first step we had is setting the data source. So remember, we do TableView Datasource. So what this is saying is that, I'm going to have the table views, what is going to provide the data to the table view? That's going to be self here, and self is basically this view controller. Okay. So if you build that, now it's giving me an error, right? It's saying, okay, you want to assign this, that's fine, but view controller currently is not of the specific type. What they're basically saying is that your view controller currently does not conform to UI TableView Datasource. So I could just type the extension code down here by myself, but Xcode is nice, right? If you click on here, you can do fix, and it gives you a bunch of functions here. Do I want this? Not quite, right? Because sure, these are the correct functions, but these functions, like remember when we talked about having extensions, right? I don't want to write them all up here, because if I have a bunch of other things that I want to conform to, it's just going to cover my entire file. So I'm going to move these down. So I cut that. I'm going to do extension. View controller, and I'm going to extend it of UITableView Datasource, and I paste these functions in. Okay. So now I need to implement these two functions, right? So this function is asking me for the number of rows I have in each section, but I don't know that, right? Because I don't have data yet. So let's just create some data for now. And just to save time, I have the data here, copy and pasted. So let's just stick it in here. Oh, okay. So cafeteria. So Okay, so what I was trying to do there is, okay, that's fine. So what I did there is I just have these kind of preset values of cafeterias, kind of, so I don't want to type them out. But you can create more data and just like put that there for fun if you want. And I defined this cafs array, which is going to store all my cafeterias. Okay, so that's the setup for that part. Now, when I'm trying to answer the question, the number of rows I want to display, now I do have an answer, right? Because I have my cafs, which store the number of cafeterias I have. So to return the number of rows I want, I just return how many cafeterias I have, which is, oh, can't spell. Okay, return the number of items in my cafeterias. Okay, array, cafeteria array. So that's the first part. That's done. Okay, I'll fix that later. There we go. Okay, so we implemented the first function. Now let's implement the second function, right? So now we need to tell the table view what I want to display at a certain row. And, I want to display the cell, right? But I haven't actually defined that cell. So let's create the cell now. So to create the cell, we go to File, New, File, and we'll create a Kahoot Touch class. So we had a few questions about like what's the difference between a Swift file and a Kahoot Touch class. So the Swift file is just like, it's kind of like the base, right? You can like write anything you want in the Swift file, doesn't really matter. A Kahoot Touch class is if you want it to kind of implement or kind of inherit like a specific UI component, right, of UIKit. So over here, it kind of already guessed what I wanted, but over here specifically, I'm creating some file to kind of represent my UITableView cell. So over here, I know I specifically want to implement this UITableView cell, which is part of UIKit, so I would use a Kahoot Touch class here. And the subclass is UITableView cell here, and I'll just give it a good name, like CAF_TableView cell. Okay. And we'll create that. I should create a file here. And now let's actually implement what we want to put in this TableView cell. So I can actually just delete this. I don't need any of this. And let's give it an init function. This one. And style. And use identifier. So what I did just now is I created a initialization function for my TableView cell. And then since I'm kind of overriding the default TableView cell, which is just a blank cell, when you're overriding something, you kind of need to like set up its parent first, right? So I'm doing super.init. That's just setup code. You don't have to care about that. And notice how Xcode is giving me another error, right? It's saying I'm missing this initializer init, this required initializer init. We don't actually have to care about this because this is to do with this thing called an interface builder with Xcode. We're not actually using it. So let's just kind of like make Xcode happy and just click fix, and we can just ignore this this function for now. Okay, so now we can actually start implementing this TableView cell. So, okay, so I guess at this point, I haven't really showed you what it looked like. I should have showed you this at the beginning, my bad. But this is what we're going to be implementing. I'm sorry. So we have this table, right? I can scroll up and down. Currently, there's only 4 pieces of data, so there's no idea of like kind of recycling cells for now. But if we click on it, right, we can kind of have this heart toggle appear and disappear, right? And that is like the core functionality of this table. So let's have a look at what this table looks like, right? We have a UI label up top. We have another UI label kind of on the bottom of the cell, and then we have this image on the right. So let's lay that out. Name var name label. Oh, and by the way, this is like the completed version, right? We haven't actually implemented all of this just yet. Name label, this is of type UI label, and I am going to create a label, and I am going to set its font. So this is set up for what it's going to look like. False, and I return the label. Okay, so that's the name label. So what I did here is I just kind of set the font, and I make sure that I set this, kind of like so I can use my programmatic constraints, right? That's the name label. Then I also want to have the rating labels we have up here, right? So var rating label is of type UI label. Var label is equal to UI label. Label.font. Custom font of size, say 12. And we also want to have this translate auto remasking to be false. And then I return the label. Right, so I've set up the name label, I've set up the ratings label. Now I want to set up the image view. And so actually at this point, I just want to show you. So in the starter code, we have the image kind of here in the assets. This is like the heart. So we can kind of get it by doing UI image named and kind of putting the name of the image, right? So let's set that up. So we're going to have a heart image view. It's going to be of type image view. And let's create a image view. It's going to be UI image view. And let's have the image view content mode, scale aspect fit. So these are just the variables you can play with. But this is basically how we set up the image view. Is hidden to be true. And I'll talk about why we're setting it to be true for now. Sorry, not for now, in a bit. But for now, we're going to set it as hidden. For now, hidden. And then finally, we also want to make sure that we can use our programmatic constraints. So translate auto size to be false, and then we return this image view. Okay, so I've set up the name label, rating label, image view. Okay, so what's going on? Yeah, I guess. Oh, okay. Wait, I think I know what's going on. Equals? Equals. One second. Oh, okay, yeah. So, the code is fine, but it's erroring because we haven't implemented this cell for row at, right? And that's basically what we're doing right now. We're kind of creating the cell, and after we're done with the cell, we can actually return the cell here, right? So for now, so Xcode's not getting mad at me. I'm just going to comment it out, right? And let's just kind of ignore that for now. So now we have the three UI kind of components of our cell. Now let's actually lay it out. So hopefully this part should be very familiar, right? This is the idea of kind of creating these UI stuff and kind of lay it out on the screen. So I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly. Set up constraints. So I'm creating this constraints function here. Let's move it down. Let's put it here. And I am going to create two variables. Padding, cd float, 8. Label height, cd float, 20. And so this is just like a small piece of like advice when you're writing these constraints or layouts as just like a programmer, right? Because later on in the hack challenge, you're going to be working with a team, and maybe you have a designer, right? And the designer is going to give you like how to put things around, so you don't actually have to kind of like test with different paddings and values. But if you don't have a designer, you're kind of doing it yourself. You can actually design it, but that's one way of doing it. Another way is just you have these paddings and kind of label height variables that you kind of define. And when you write your code, just use those variables. And when you're testing values, you just kind of put in different values and just run at different times, and you can see like how it looks, right? So that's just idea of like factoring out these constants, so it's easier for you to actually change. So now let's just set up the constraints. I'm just going to speed through this. But basically, I'm just going to make it look like that. Okay. So this name label, I want it to be at the top, so I'm going to have its leading anchor be the content view dot leading anchor and constant of padding. And another like small difference here is that note how before when we're working within the view controller, you know, when we're constraining things, we constrain it to view.leading anchor or like view.safe area layout guide.top anchor. Right over here, I'm using content view, and that's just a small like difference between view controllers and say these other UI view subclasses. Since I'm not within a view controller, I actually have to I'm referring to the same thing here. Like view is basically a different name. It's called content view, right? So you can like just for all purposes, you can just kind of read this as view.leading anchor. Okay. So now I want to set the top anchor. The top anchor is going to equal to content view dot top anchor of constant padding. And then I want to set the height anchor equal to a constant. And that constant is going to be label height. So that is my label. Now I'm going to set up the rating label and also the heart image view. So another trick here is that if I want to edit multiple lines of text, I can hold down Option. See how there's like this question mark here, and I can just drag it. And so the oops, okay, let's try that again. So I highlight here and I drag it. And so all the things that are highlighted right now are like I can edit all of them at once, right? So if I press backspace, they all disappear. And notice I have 3 cursors here, so I can type at the same time and be like, hello, right? So over here, I'm setting up my rating label, right? So I do rating label. And so now I'm like changing the rating labels constraints, right? And, because like they're all labels, I'm dealing with the same leading, height, and top anchor. But what it's actually constrained to is a little different here. So let's change that. This is constrained to the name label's leading anchor. And this is going to be right underneath the name label. So this is also going to be constrained to the name label, but it's bottom anchor. And the constant here is, okay, so actually I don't need the constant here, interesting. And also I don't need the constant here. So again, this is just making sure that, what we actually build here is same as the demo. And finally, the height anchor is also going to be the height anchor. Cool. So, that doesn't need to be there. So that's the rating label. And finally, let's do the heart image view. And I want to give it a height and width anchor. Let's say 16. Anchor. Constant, let's say 16. And then I'm just going to center it. So dot center y anchor equal to content view dot center y anchor. Oh, commas. Commas. And I'm going to have it be kind of at the end. So I'm going to set its trailing anchor constraint equal to content view. Content view dot trailing anchor. And I need to give it a constant of negative padding. Okay, cool. Now we're done with all this constraints. Okay, so again, right? It says build failed because of the previous non-implemented cell for row at. But notice how there's no errors on this file, so we're good. That's nice. Now, now we basically have the the TableView cell set up, and we can kind of go back to this view controller and actually implement this function now. So, one second. Yes. So here we basically want to use our custom cell, right? Instead of actually using the default cell that TableViews have, we use our custom cell. So we do if let cell is equal to TableView dot DQ reusable cell with identifier, right? So this is the idea of kind of using the cell, right? So you have multiple values. I kind of want to get this. I want to basically use the cell that is has been kind of disposed of and kind of recycle it, right? And the identifier is to make sure that I don't get the wrong cell. And I defined a constant up top here of reuse identifier, so let's just use it here. So this gives me basically a cell, right? So remember of iflets, right? If I don't have a DQ reusable cell, then kind of it doesn't get called. So within iflet, now I can actually set up the cell, right? Because notice how in this cell, right, it's different depending on what the cafeteria is, right? That's basic behavior we want. So we actually need to provide the cell a function to kind of set it up, right? Because by default, it has all these labels and the image is kind of all laid out, but it doesn't have any values, right? So let's give it a function to kind of set up the data. I'm going to call it configure. Oh, and actually, I forgot to call setup constraints here. That would have been a bad mistake. But yeah, so let's create a configure function. Let's go here. Configure. And basically what this is doing is it's taking in a cafeteria, and it's basically laying or like providing this cell with the correct information to actually display it. And so since it's going to take in a cafeteria, let's give it a variable called caf of type cafeteria. And what we're actually displaying is the text of the cafeteria. So name label dot text, sorry, not the text, the name of the cafeteria. So name. And we also want to set its rating label to be whatever the rating is of the cafeteria. And the way we do that is we use string interpolation, as we've shown before. So over here, we kind of like provide the rating within this brace, right? So how do we get that? Remember, in the cafeteria file, we have this helper function called getRatingString. So we do that, caf.getRatingString. And we are done with this file. Again, right, it's failed because we haven't implemented this self-override, but we're going to do that right now. Okay, let's do it right now so it stops erroring. So now we have the cell's configure function. So basically what that configure function is doing is we pass in a cafeteria, it populates the cell, and after we populate the cell, we can return the cell. Right? That's the entire logic of self-override. We get a cell by dequeuing it, we configure it, and then we return it. So now let's actually configure it. So we got the cell, and we want to configure it. So configure.configure. Okay, if I save it over here, and I give it okay, so I just want to give it a placeholder value so it stops erroring, but okay, we're gonna have to deal with this error just for a little longer. But now we want to configure it. And now we have one issue, right? Now I'm dequeuing the cell, but notice how just now when I'm kind of calling the configure function, right? First of all, it didn't autofill. That's not good. Second of all, notice how it says that this method may not be defined here. This issue is kind of like, it's basically saying, right, when I get this, or like when I dequeue a cell, it's of type UITableViewCell, right? But like a default UITableViewCell does not have this configure function. The type of TableView cell that actually has this configure function is the one that I defined. So what I'm going to do here, and you should only do this when you like have thought about your code, is cast it forcefully into a cafeteria caf TableView cell. Right. So what I'm saying is, oh god, what is going on? Okay, fine. Okay, cool. So now I'm basically casting the TableView cell, and so I'm casting it as the custom cell I'm creating, right? So now I can actually access the configure function. See, so now it's actually highlighted, and I can pass in a cafeteria. So, but before that, we need to actually get the cafeteria, and the way we get that is cafeteria is equal to kind of this index path, right? So I have a array of data, right? And this function gives me an index, kind of like I, right? So at row I, what I want to display, well, I want to display cafeteria I, right? So how I do that is I get the cafeteria from my array of cafeterias, and I index into the index path. This is kind of like, remember, it's like kind of like row I, right? And I get the row number. So this is basically what this line is doing, right? I'm getting the cafeteria that corresponds to that row, and I actually pass it in here. So I pass in the cafeteria. Cool. So everything up to here is fine. Now it's complaining because I haven't returned the cell, right? So let's actually return it so it stops complaining. Okay, now it should actually work. So I don't know why it's complaining. Oh, okay, yes. Here, let me fix this. Nice. Okay, so one small fix I forgot just now, but like there's an off chance where your code doesn't actually work, even like if you reasoned it through the way we did just now. But you kind of dequeue the cell, but the cell is not actually the custom cell you created. So let's give it a fail-safe value of like, if I don't actually get my custom cell, then I just give you a default TableView cell. Okay. So what we did here just now, we implemented the cell for row at function, and what that basically did is it allowed us to return a custom cell, and we configure it in a certain way to provide it the custom data. And after we kind of set up the cell, give it the correct data, configure it, we return it. Okay, so that's the cell for row at function. Cool. So if I run this, this shouldn't actually display anything because we forgot one crucial step. Right. So we see, right? We actually have like these rows that are kind of just like there, right? And then like clicking on it by turning it gray is like default behavior of a TableView, of a TableView and a TableView cell. But what we're missing here is we forgot to actually register the cell, right? Remember, there's like 3 steps. We set the data source and the delegate. We're going to do it in just a bit. Right, we're going to do this right after. But we forgot to register it, right? So we need to do TableView.register cell class, and then we do CathViewCell.self, and then identifier is right. What this is saying is, I'm like, I want to have my cells be a specific. What happened? Okay, so I probably messed up something in my constraints. But yeah, so continuing on what I said just now, this is basically saying my table over here is going to use my custom cells. Okay, so now let's debug this constraint error. Let's see. Center anchor with anchor. Okay, so I think I know what the issue is, and I created a bunch of these UI views, but I haven't added them. So let's add them. Content view dot add subview, name label. I add rating label, and I add part image view. Set it up, run, and it's running. It's running. Oh, it's not running. Okay. Now it's running. There we go, right? So now it looks like, so I probably messed up the padding a little bit, but this doesn't actually affect the behavior, right? So now we have our kind of cells laid out, right? So the point of this demo is just to show you how it works, right? If you actually want to make it pretty and stuff, you can kind of mess around with the constraints and a bunch of other values. But yeah, this is a basic functionality. Now, the final part of this lecture is kind of show how I can interact with it, right? So right now we have this click on it and becoming gray behavior. That's default, right? What if I wanted to kind of display the heart that I had just now? So the way we do that is now we actually need to implement the delegate part. So this delegate part here, which I commented out, right, is what allows the table view to kind of have user interaction. Right, and as always, right, after I kind of conform the view controller to a specific class, to a specific protocol, I actually need to implement it, right? So what I do here is extension, view controller of type UI table view, where is it? Here, TableView Delegate. I save, and there are 2 functions I want to implement here. The first one is just to make it look a bit better, right? So right now, the height of my rows are kind of default, right? It's just the default, I think it's 25, I'm not too sure though. Is the default height. So if I want to set a custom height, I implement the height for row at. And so again, so one very important thing to remember when you're dealing with these is you don't ever have to type out the entire function header here, right, with a bunch of variables. Nobody remembers them. You have to, the only part you have to remember is this blue part here, which is kind of the name of the function. You just type the first couple characters of it and you press enter and the entire thing fills in, right? So height for row at, over here I kind of return the height for the row. Let's say 50. Let's give it more space. And then it should look a little better. There we go, right? Cool. So that's the first part. Second part now is the interaction. So I click on it, I want the heart to appear, right? And so kind of going back just now, remember how I set the heart's initial value to be is hidden as true? That's the reason, the point of doing that is so that at the beginning when I launch it, the hearts aren't displaying, which is kind of saying that they're like not favorited, right? I only want to favorite it after I click on it. So we need to implement this toggling behavior here. So did select row at basically implements the function or the behavior after I click on the specific cell, right? So first thing we want to do is we actually want to get the corresponding cafeteria. And the way we do that is we do it the same way as we kind of got the correct cafeteria to display, right? So we have this index path here that's kind of like remembers like the I of like the ith row, for example, of my table view. And so I get kind of the index path, oh, oops, wrong one, index path dot row. I get the corresponding cafeteria, and then I am going to set its isFavorite value, right, to be true. So basically when I click on it, I want it to be the favorite, right? But that's actually not the entire behavior, right? Because after I click on it, a heart appears, cool. But I also want to like hide it when I click on it again, right? So there's this function called toggle, which basically, if it's true, it turns into false. If it's false, it turns into true, right? That only works in Booleans. So cafeteria is favorite.toggle. So if it's false, it's true now. Now, after I implement it, now I want to kind of update the actual like UI or like how the cell looks. And this is a very important step. A lot of people forget to do this when they're working on the project. They're like, well, I changed the value of the cafeteria. Shouldn't the cell update, right? And the answer is no, because you didn't tell it to update. So when you actually update the cell, we make another function. We call it toggle heart. And what this function does, it basically, toggles the heart. So right now our heart is implemented as an image view, and its isHidden value is true. So let's make it false. Is hidden equal to false, right? Or another way we can do it is hidden.toggle, right? Again, same, because it's a Boolean, I can like turn on, turn off. Right, so I'm toggling the isHidden, and now we've kind of set the correct value for the cafeteria. Now we tell the cell to update. How do we get the cell? We need to do we do it the same way we did over here, right? We do the if let here. So if let cell is equal to TableView dot cell for row at, we give it the index path. And okay, so let me just write this out first before I explain it. Cell dot toggle heart. Okay, so what I did here is I'm kind of getting now the corresponding cell, right? So over here, I'm getting the corresponding cafeteria for the specific row. Over here, I'm getting the corresponding cell, right? The correct cell, the correct cafeteria. And again, I'm doing this force casting here, right? For the exact same reasons before. I force cast, sorry, I'm not force casting here. I'm just casting normally. I'm casting here because like the default UI TableView cell does not have this custom toggle heart function, right? And I know for a fact that I'm using my own custom cells. Therefore, I cast it into a custom cell, and then I have access to this toggle heart function. So that should be it. So if I run this now, it should work. See, I click on it, it doesn't work. Okay, what is going on? Let's try to fix that. So, okay, so one shortcut I took, I think that might be the reason here, is that I just did toggle. But a more correct way of doing it is kind of to have the actual cell reflect the data. So isHidden should be not isFavorite. So is 5 is bool, not is 5. And then over here, when I'm toggling it, I would pass in cafeteria dot is favorite. Okay. Oh, okay, is cool. Okay, so what I fixed just now, let's see if it works first. Okay, what is going on? So what I fixed just now is I basically have the cell actually reflect the data of the cafeteria instead of just using the toggling trick, which is actually a lot better than just like the toggling left and toggling right. But it's not showing, so let's try to debug that. Oh, okay, so I didn't set the extra image, so it's there, but there is no image. So let's set the image. Oh, heart. There we go. Okay, so that's the end of the demo. Sorry for taking that long. Yeah, so some action items. I didn't write them, but basically just to reiterate, right? P3 is due today, but you know, slip days apply, so it's due on Wednesday. Sorry, you can hand it in on Wednesday with no penalty. And on Wednesday, we're going to announce the mentor event. It's a good opportunity to kind of get close help from one of the iOS members, and is also a great way to meet new people and build on fun apps. So that's all for this lecture. You're free to go. And thanks for coming to today's lecture. Thanks.